Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Donald C. Stewart and I am delighted to be joined in the studio this evening with William Duguid. William, great to see you. I know you're a great friend of the programmes and we're delighted to have you with us.
I'm delighted to visit your salubrious studio for the first time.
There must have been something in the coffee. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome. And unfortunately, we always start with a sombre update from day 258 in Ukraine. Ukraine has said its position in negotiations with Russia had not changed and it is not being asked to negotiate by its allies after reports by the Washington Post that its main ally and backer, the United States, had asked Kyiv to signal that it is open to negotiations. Ukrainian presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolyak told Radio Svoboda that Ukraine will only negotiate with Russia once Russian troops have left all of Ukraine's territory, including those it occupied in 2014. Podolyak said that the US treats Ukraine as an equal and there is no coercion. The Secretary of Ukraine's Security Council said today as well that the main condition for the resumption of negotiations with Russia would be the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said his forces are gradually pushing back Russian troops in some parts of the east and in the south. Russia is stepping up its effort to build substantial obstacles and barriers to slow the advance of Ukrainian forces in key locations, according to the United Kingdom Ministry of Defence. Russian President Vladimir Putin will join next week's G20 Leaders Summit if the situation is possible, Indonesian President Joko Widodo, the meeting's host, said today. President Zelensky will take part in the G20 summit in Bali, most likely attending virtually. Mikhail Razvoyevich, the governor of Sevastopol in Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014, said this morning that air defences in the city shot down a Ukrainian drone. Meanwhile, Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson will seek Turkey's approval for his country's bid to join NATO during talks later on Tuesday in Ankara with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. A further 30 Ukrainian service personnel who were captured from Ukraine's Snake Island have been released from Russian captivity. And Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the US ambassador to the United Nations, visited Kyiv today where she met Ukrainian Minister of Infrastructure Alexander Kubrakov. Putin has said that 50,000 Russian soldiers called up as part of his mobilization drive are now fighting with combat units in Ukraine. However, criticism is growing over the rising number of Russian conscripts being killed. And North Korea has said that it has never had arms dealings with Russia and has no plans to do so, according to its state media. William, every day it seems to get more and more dangerous and difficult, and certainly at some point there's going to have to be negotiations, but there's a clear statement coming from Ukraine as to what the conditions for that would be.
Absolutely, yes. We're getting into just the sticky stage of the war, particularly with winter coming on. And I think that Ukraine's forcing back of the Russian troops with all the obstacles and everything will become increasingly difficult. And you do wonder where it will all eventually end and where the negotiations will go and what the end game is. So I think we still have quite a lot of time to go here. And of course, it's such a key event, the whole war, in the whole world situation at the minute, what with climate change crisis being talked about at the moment and all the knock-on effects and that, as well as the humanitarian effects of the war. It's just a sad and depressing story going on.
And you mentioned the climate change crisis, and of course the other piece of international news is COP27, as the First Minister has confirmed another £5 million loss and damage funding at COP27. This is an additional £5 million of funding to tackle loss and damage announced by Nicola Sturgeon at the Climate Summit. The funds take Scotland's commitment to addressing loss and damage caused by the climate crisis to vulnerable countries within the world to £7 million to enable communities to take direct action to address the impacts of loss and damage, including slow onset effects such as sea level rise and non-economic effects such as the loss of cultural identity. It will also help to tackle existing inequalities, including gender inequalities, which are exacerbated by the effects of climate change. Meanwhile, a summary report has been published following on from October's International Loss and Damage Conference hosted by the Scottish Government in Edinburgh. Addressing loss and damage practical action highlights the clear funding gap for action to address non-economic and slow onset loss ahead of a more extensive report to follow COP27. In line with the conclusions of that conference, the delivery of grant funding rather than loans will ensure that no additional debt burden for recipient countries and that the process will be community-led and community-owned. Drawn from the £36 million Climate Justice Fund, grants will be delivered over the next 3 years in a way that ensures communities and countries most impacted by the climate crisis have a clearer say in how the funds should be allocated. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said, in virtually everything we do on loss and damage, Scotland is trying to ensure that we listen to international perspectives, especially the perspectives of the Global South. After all, for more than 30 years now, since the views of island states were first ignored, decisions at COP have been dominated by the voices of the Global North. The funding Scotland has announced today is a small sum in terms of the overall scale of the loss and damage that developing countries face, but I hope that it sends an important message. As Denmark and Wallonia have shown, governments can act now in loss and damage if we want to. We don't need to wait for a consensus decision at COP. We can start funding programmes straight away. I very much hope that we will make collective progress on loss and damage at this COP. If that doesn't happen, I expect that more and more governments will take action on their own. And William, I think that taking action on your own is a very important step, and it's certainly one that we seem to be leading the way in.
I think it is. This whole issue of loss and damage, there was a bit of a struggle to get it on the agenda for this COP at all. That is a disgrace, since we're looking at something that's been 30 years in the making, 30 years since the affected countries first started to say, this is a problem, this needs fixing. And therefore, I thought it was a very good speech from Nicola Sturgeon today. I think it addressed some really fairly key points, that what we're doing here is creating a precedent. That happened last year, and hopefully the precedent will be extended this year with other countries joining in, even if, as I suspect, there isn't going to be a COP27 consensus. It's also good to make clear that this loss and damage payment, which is for things that have already happened or that you can't avert by any of the other means, is completely separate from the mitigation and adaptation measures that will be funded as well. So we're addressing the problem as holistically as we can, and I think it's great for Scotland to be able on the international stage to do this sort of thing. And for all the commentators who said she shouldn't even be there, this is just a jolly. Today's speech and the events of today just show how ridiculous a viewpoint that is.
And I suppose, in a sense, what we've got is on the international stage, there's a shine coming from our participation, which would suggest that going forward, if we had the opportunity to further shine, that Scotland could make a further major contribution.
Yes, absolutely. It's always in Scotland's interests, before we become independent, to act not perhaps as if we're independent, but pretty close to it, and to be seen to be taking a leading role or an important or strategically significant role in the big issues that face the world. In terms of the climate crisis, we have a lot to offer. So our place at the table to be talking about these things is absolutely justified. And, let's hope that other countries join in.
I suppose as well, Nicola Sturgeon was talking about the sort of global north and the global south. There's an element in many ways of that kind of colonial nature, that the rich do good for the poor and the poor should somehow be grateful for it. But in actual fact, what we should be looking for in a more global, holistic way as to what can be done in order to ensure that we all survive.
It's absolutely for all of us to survive here. This is not global handouts. This is climate justice. And that's important, because we did this. And the countries who were affected, by and large, in fact, in some cases, did nothing to bring this about, and they are the ones suffering. It's no good just mitigating future effects when your country's getting blown apart by typhoons and hurricanes every other year. It needs to be addressed, because This is the survival of the whole of the planet, the whole of the species, I should say. The planet will get on just fine without us. It might get on better without us. But yeah, it's such a key thing. And I believe this is a very, very important COP27, because I reckon COP26, for all the honeyed words, the fallout from that, the reaction, the follow-up and promises just was not there. And we need to get this right. This year would be good if we could, but pretty soon, because we're already seeing the effects as the weather conditions and other things just continue to grow.
And whilst the First Minister has been in COP27, the Scottish Government have recommended today withholding consent for the retained EU law bill, lodging a legislative consent memorandum recommending that the Scottish Parliament withhold its consent for the UK government's retained EU law reform and revocation bill. Bit of a mouthful. The bill seeks to revoke over 2,400 pieces of EU legislation that were included in the United Kingdom Statute Book at the end of the Brexit transition period. In a letter to Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Grant Shapps, Constitution Secretary Angus Robertson has set out the Scottish Government's rationale for recommending Parliament withhold its consent. The letter reiterates the concern and the fundamental opposition of Scottish ministers to the legislation and highlights the concerns of some bodies such as RSPB Scotland and Greener UK, who say the bill will derail urgent action to tackle the nature and climate crisis and rip up our most important nature protections in Scotland. This is another area of major concern. It, of course, mentions the climate crisis and amongst it, but it's not just that. Nearly 2,500 protections up for grabs that potentially could disappear because of the dividend, if I may ever call it that, of Brexit.
Yeah, and they will just disappear. There isn't necessarily, I suspect, going to be time to legislate to replace them all. And the way they disappear is that the bill just has a sunset clause in it that basically wipes them off the statute book from the end of December 2023. And that is a frighteningly short timetable. So in terms of just the effective management of the economy, I think there's a huge risk being taken. But of course, beyond that, there's also the blatant attack on devolution, because a lot of the areas that this bill will touch on will affect devolved areas. I'm particularly concerned about the food sector. You may have read Ruth Watson's article in The National in the last couple of days about just that. And the key thing that she brought out for me about this bill as it currently stands is that if you replace the standards that the EU had, you can only replace them with something as good or worse. You can't improve on them, which to me is an absurd position and a complete revocation of all the arguments for Brexit in the first place, as if there weren't enough of those.
I think that's probably what startled me, that it was so wide-ranging, and it goes beyond the taking back control of our borders argument that came in the 2016 referendum, that actually it's abolishing many of the byproducts of being part of a bigger organisation, that we had these protections not only in terms of employment rights and so on, but also the sort of food hygiene ones. And much though there's no scaremongering going on in terms of this is going to end up with chlorinated chickens perhaps, but the possibility suddenly is opened up and may exist that we are going to not only follow lesser standards but also be thrown into the midst of it.
Well, that's us. We're on the sales counter for the Americans now, aren't we? That's really what's behind this. But another concern is, how are we going to go on trading in certain sectors with the EU if we just aren't meeting their standards? And that's important because there's absolutely no way that all the trading links we had with the EU are being replaced that fast. So what sort of future do we have for trading in the economy? It's almost as if they just can't get away from the EU fast enough. And again, that's a revocation of the sort of arguments that were going on in the Brexit debate. Now we just seem to be pulling up the drawbridge and hoping for the best. And on the other side of it, we're in the shop window for big American conglomerates to come along and do what they will. And it's not what Scotland voted for. And increasingly, I think within the UK, people are saying that's not what we voted for either.
And it tramples over any kind of vow, if I may use that phrase, in terms of what it was going to be like post any referendum, particularly because it tramples across any devolved settlement. This is retaining, taking, removing powers that were given.
They're coming for the powers that already exist. The chance of us getting more powers the only way to do that is by taking them all.
And also today, Scotland is due to lose 2 MPs in the Boundary Commission's proposals, published for Scottish constituencies in the House of Commons as part of a plan to reduce the number of seats for the country. Scotland will have 57 constituencies under the latest review of the boundary condition, 2 fewer than at present. Meanwhile, England has been allocated 543 seats, which is a rise of 10. Northern Ireland will remain unchanged at 18, and Wales will lose 8, leaving it with 32 MPs. The total number of MPs at Westminster, for those of you good at maths, will remain at 650. 2 Scottish constituencies, the Western Isles and Orkney and Shetland, are protected by legislation and cannot be changed. The remaining 55 seats must have between 69,724 and 77,062 voters, unless they are larger than 12,000 square kilometres, where a smaller number is allowed. But constituencies are also not allowed to exceed the maximum permitted area of 13,000 square kilometres. And of the 55 mainland constituencies, 20 are unchanged from those put forward in the initial proposals. However, 3 constituencies have had their proposed name changed. 35, their boundaries changed, and 20 have both their proposed name and boundaries altered. The changes will see the proposed Inverness-shire and Wester Ross seat become the largest constituency in terms of area at 11,066 square kilometres, smaller than the current Ross, Skye and Lochaber, which is just over 12,500 square kilometres. The smallest constituency in terms of area will be Glasgow West, which is just 19 square kilometres, larger than the smallest existing seat, which is Glasgow North, which is 17 square kilometres. The changes could see Glasgow South East become the seat with fewest voters, with the proposed constituency having 69,748 electors, 20,000 plus more than in Caithness, Sutherland and Eastern Ross, who will have 46,000, in fact just short of 47,000, which will now become the seat with the fewest voters. Clackmannanshire and Forth Valley would be the seat with most voters under the revised plans, with 77,000 electors living within its boundaries, less than the 88,500 living within the current Linlithgow and East Falkirk constituency. A 4-week-long public consultation on the revised proposal will run up until the 5th of December, with the Commission to develop its final recommendations after this, before submitting a report to the Speaker of the House of Commons by the 1st of July 2023. Of course, William, it's always the gerrymandering debate, but with the loss of 2 MPs, won't Labour be wondering where they're going to get their majority from at any election if they're going to have less opportunity to try and win back those things that they seem to have lost in perpetuity?
It's not their biggest problem in doing that. Their biggest problem is completely failing to understand what the voters of Scotland are thinking. If they changed that, maybe they'd have some chance, even with reduced MPs. But there you go, that's up to them.
Indeed it is. But this is something that happens regularly. There's nothing necessarily sinister about it. But it does, I suppose, in a sense, Wales losing 8.
Yes, they will feel that, I think. I have to be honest with you, I don't particularly feel that losing 2 is particularly bad, because I expect this to be a short-term scenario and that very soon our number of MPs will be 0. However, I can understand how some people might be a little bit upset about it. And it is noticeable, and it's an inevitable consequence of population. And the population of England is growing, and the population of Scotland, and I assume Wales, is not. to anything like the same extent. And so more and more, this becomes Greater England, does it not, over time?
Indeed, and the interesting thing as well for me is that Northern Ireland does not change. And looking at the demographic changes,
Don't mess with Northern Ireland.
I mean, the interesting, now there is a Catholic majority within the province. Whether that will make any difference in the forthcoming election, of course, will be interesting to note.
Yeah, there's a lot to chew on here. I would recommend, if you're not happy with what's being proposed, and it'll take you time to get into it, because some of these boundary changes, particularly the coloured maps we've seen, are quite hard to follow. But do respond to the consultation. That's what it's for. I mean, at least if you get ignored, you can say, well, I tried and we were ignored, and add that to the grievance if necessary. That's fine. But have your say.
I think that's also part of the democratic deficit, isn't it? We saw that after the 2014 referendum, that people actually became enlivened by the idea of having a say. And I think that when it comes to things like this, the opportunity to do so is something people should grab with both hands.
100%. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we talked earlier on about the Brexit debacle or opportunity, depending on which side of the fence you sit on, and today the BCC chief, the British Chambers of Commerce chief, has said there is no evidence of any Brexit dividend whatsoever. Siobhan Haviland, Director General, has told Bloomberg that UK firms are yet to see any upside from Brexit, and urged Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to improve the trade agreement with the European Union to boost growth. Ms Haviland said that Rishi Sunak should pursue a veterinary agreement to remove checks on food products, which would be of immediate benefit to Scotland's world-class food and drink sector. The BCC chief also called for changes to the visa system for skilled workers from Europe to work in the UK to fill the gaps in the labour market caused by Brexit. Commenting on South of Scotland MSP Emma Harper said, again, we have even more confirmation that Brexit doesn't work. Businesses in Scotland have taken a hammer blow because of Brexit and continue to suffer as a result. The only way they and the rest of Scotland can flourish is by escaping Brexit and becoming an independent country back in the European Union. Scotland's economy has suffered the double whammy of leaving the EU and the Tory-made cost of living crisis. Last week we learned that Scottish exports had nosedived by 13% since Brexit. However, there is no way back to the EU under Westminster control, with Labour signed up as a fully fledged Brexit party. No matter the economic consequences, Labour will keep Scotland out of the European Union, a market 7 times the size of the UK. It's hard, William, to know where to go with Brexit. Almost everybody is queuing up to say there's no benefit here.
And influential voices. I mean, the British Chamber of Commerce is an influential voice. But I can't see really anybody outside of the realm of still politics who's saying this was a great thing. We feel really enlivened by it and all the opportunities we've got, because the opportunities aren't there. When we write the history in not very long from now, I'm pretty sure that Brexit will be perceived as an absolute disaster on almost every level. And you talked about Scotland's exports to the EU nosediving. I almost believed you when you said since breakfast, because I would believe that. And if you look at that in the context of the story we mentioned earlier, the only way is down. It's all downhill from here. At some point, I do expect sanity of some sort to prevail, because the pressure, even on the Tories, will become so intense that they will have to change something. And I think Labour are probably still on track to win the next election, although you just never know. It's incredibly disappointing that they went for, let's do Brexit, but with more marks for artistic merit. Because the voters who are, I believe, increasingly coming over in England to let's change this back have nowhere to go.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I remember from the last election is a number of people who in England were saying if only we had a left-leaning party, and going further back, I know that they had Corbyn there, but that we knew that it was unlikely that he was going to end up winning the election. Decent left-leaning former Labour, current Labour Party supporters in England don't seem to have an option.
Effectively disenfranchised. Labour, as the Tories move to the right, Labour, it's almost like a gravitational pull. Let's take the space they've abandoned. And, okay, in pure strategic terms, it's got a lot to be said for it, I guess. But in terms of the effect on your core support, not good at all.
Do you think that they're going to get anywhere in terms of the red wall seats in the north of England? I certainly don't believe that there's going to be any traction or move up in Scotland.
I very much doubt. There are some polls with very small subsamples in Scotland that are trying to claim that Labour are getting some of that ground back. I suspect that if they do get that ground back, it'll be because they'll be perceived as the party of the union, and therefore commensurately the Tories will lose ground. So it shouldn't have any overall effect on the makeup of the political landscape here. But I don't know about Labour with the red wall. The red wall was kind of a one-off, and I think that even those areas that said something has to change, this is something, let's go for it, and voted Tory, I think they'll be really looking at everything now and probably going back to Labour. I think that's where Labour has its best chance. You'll notice that the fact that Labour are miles ahead in the polls doesn't sort of seem to occur to me a jot, because I've seen this sort of lead get lost before.
Indeed we have. And also at home, Holyrood's Social Justice and Social Security Committee have published a report calling for borrowing powers for Holyrood. The new report has called on Holyrood to be given the borrowing powers from Westminster in order to allow them to tackle the cost of living crisis, as well as hearing key evidence for key Tory welfare policies to be scrapped at Westminster to tackle child poverty. The evidence was outlined in a report published today, which also outlines evidence presented to Holyrood by a leading child poverty charity on the need for additional resourcing from the UK government to address the cost of living crisis. Emma Roddick, MSP, who sits in the committee, said, "This new report shows clearly that the devolution settlement is not fit for purpose. As the cost of living crisis deepens, the Scottish Government is already using the powers it has, but as is clear in today's report, the Scottish Parliament needs borrowing powers from Westminster to go further." And William, it's interesting who oppose the increase in borrowing powers. It's not just the usual suspects.
Well, the Conservatives opposed it, as you would expect, the two Conservatives who sit on that committee, but the two Labour folk who sit on that committee as well opposed it. And it does make me wonder, how do they expect the Scottish Government, from a literally restricted budget, to make room for totally addressing the cost of living crisis, when it's clear that inflation is making every plan have to be ripped up? And one can't help but think that they're perfectly happy to see the devolved government in Scotland struggle so that they can throw stones at it. Possibly even it's the start of their campaign to get it out of there, because let's face it, it keeps electing governments that want independence, and that's not a popular area for them. So, yeah, I thought it was scandalous that they didn't support it. And I would like to hear them explain exactly why. I don't think we'll get it, though.
Well, it's interesting, I think, because is there a defence, in terms of here's something that could be, the shoulder could be put to the wheel in order to help struggling families, working class families, families who are in poverty, families who are in crisis, but yet we're not willing to shoulder that responsibility. Is there anywhere to go for a Labour Party?
I don't think so. It's going to be, well, you must find it from elsewhere. So stop the fripperies like that 20 million you're going to spend on the referendum, which is an infinitesimal amount, let's face it, in the context of the whole. It's almost like the party that didn't get elected, got nowhere near being elected, is dictating what the Scottish Government does with its budget, and that can't be right. That's not democratic.
Right. Also today, an interesting one that I think, William, you and I have already had a chat about, which is a very strange piece of news, which is the calls for a by-election in Dumfries and Galloway after Alistair Jack is offered a peerage and Boris Johnson's resignation honours list. There have been calls for a by-election in Dumfries and Galloway after it emerged that Alistair Jack is to be offered a peerage in Boris Johnson's resignation honours. However, it's been reported that Tory MPs have been told to hold off in taking their peerages until after the next general election to stave off the likelihood of a slew of by-election defeats. SNP Deputy Westminster leader Kirsten Oswald MP accused the Tories of running scared of democracy because they are tanking in the polls and are afraid they'll lose to the SNP if there is a by-election in Scotland. She said, if Alistair Jack wants to pop off to the archaic House of Lords, he should stand down and call a by-election, so voters in Dumfries and Galloway can have a say. Voters deserve better than a baron in waiting, biding his time until he can cash in on a £300 a day job for life in the Lords. Unlike Mr Jack, who has rubber-stamped Brexit, Tory austerity cuts and every damaging Westminster decision imposed in Scotland, an SNP MP would work hard every day to stand up for people in Dumfries and Galloway. There are some queer names that are being suggested for elevation. Perhaps I'm old enough to remember the point at where elevation into a peerage was given on some form of merit, or at least I believed that. And then when I got older, I discovered that often it was staying power that got you the opportunity to be a sir or a lord. Alistair Jack.
Well, Alistair Jack has served the state well. Of course he'll be getting his peerage. It's a bit unprecedented to hold off for 2 years. I don't think, interestingly, what will the King think of this? Will the King think he's being messed about? And he might be one to speak his mind in a way that his mother wouldn't have. So it'll be interesting to see what comes there. But Alistair Jack isn't the most surprising for me. Nadine Dorries, possibly, of I'm a Celebrity fame many years ago, if you recall, and probably just as successful as Matt Hancock is going to be. But let's not go there. Nadine Dorries, come on. The woman who basically traduced Channel 4 by saying that one of their documentaries was full of actors, which was patently not the case, and had no idea about how they were actually funded when she was trying to privatise them. And further down the list, we have one of Carrie's good friends and a former advisor to Boris Johnson also is in, quite young people as well, just being put up there. I think the whole idea of resignation honours, particularly when you've departed in some disgrace, is not very acceptable. I mean, I'm not particularly enamoured of the whole idea of the House of Lords, to be fair. So, I mean, I'm just Mr. Negative on this. But I don't think this is going to go down well with the electorate. There will not be a by-election, but it's just worth calling this out for what it is, which is just rewards for the boys and girls.
Well, of course, one of the things is that if it is I'm a Celebrity, will Kezia Dugdale be sitting by her phone waiting for a phone call because she also made her appearance in I'm a Celebrity, get me out of here. But constitutionally, and it's an interesting thing because the Constitution has been much in people's minds, going from Queen Elizabeth II to King Charles I, although Elizabeth II is
third.
Sorry, indeed, yes. I'm mixed up with their numbers because in Scotland we never had a Queen Elizabeth I, who seemed to have a dodgy connection with the Scottish Crown when she was alive. So I think, interestingly, if King Charles III does turn round and say, I have a problem with this on behalf of the people, what potentially could be the implications of that?
Lots of sales of popcorn, I think. I think it could be. You do not want, along with everything else, effectively a constitutional crisis. Now, of course, I'm sure the King and his advisors don't want a constitutional crisis either. So it probably won't happen. I was just being a wee bit mischievous. But they're trying to do things that are unprecedented. And that's never a clever idea when you are clearly struggling with other problems, because it looks like a form of gerrymandering in and of itself. And in the final analysis, whatever the King may think, the voters will have a say and they will not be pleased.
And the thing also, you mentioned Nadine Dorris, the whole trope about the Channel 4 documentary and using actors is something borrowed from America. And what we saw over there was Alex Jones, the shock jock radio host, nearly $1 billion of reparations that he has got to find to pay over because he claimed that Sandy Hook was staged and there were actors involved in that. Quite an appalling claim to make. But to see that arrive over here is not just Trumpian, it's very, very worrying. And a lot of what seems to have happened under the Conservative government in Westminster over the last 2 or 3 years is almost doing things without feeling that there's any responsibility or any comeback.
They're not being held to account properly by the media. That's the main thing. There have been some signs in some quarters, Channel 4 is one of them, revenge is sweet and a dish best served cold. But by and large, still, the Tory, whoever is wheeled out for that Sunday on Laura Kunsberg, is not going to get the same level of scrutiny that anybody from the Labour or any other party is. And we are on a downhill slope, heading towards what some people might term fascism, and it needs to be called out now, because if it's not, then a little bit down the line it will be too late.
And indeed, the F word has been mentioned in Westminster in terms of what it looks like and potentially what it is. But Nadine Dorris did actually announce that there was going to be this change to Channel 4. Liz Truss went in and Kwasi Kwarteng and announced all the material things that were going to happen. Is there anything left of the Conservative Party's 44 days in power that has yet to be overturned, or even before that, in terms of how Rishi Sunak has gone about changing everything? So is it difficult to work out which Tory party there is and who's actually not pulling the strings, but what they're going to present at the end of it?
I don't really know what the current identity of the Conservative Party is. I've never been a great student of the Conservative Party because I have a low tolerance for them. But they're very much not the party that a lot of their core vote you would expect would have voted for. Strangely enough, the membership voted for Liz Truss. They got the chance and they voted for Liz Truss. It was a pretty poor choice, I have to say, her versus Rishi Sunak. But nevertheless, they did go for her. And their views weren't tested in the most recent change of Prime Minister. Maybe in the next one they will be, but who knows? But I think I hesitate to say it, but the old sensible wing of the Conservative Party disappeared in parliamentary terms when the whip was suspended from many people who were not happy with the way Boris Johnson was doing things. And I don't in the short term see a comeback from that. The way this is normally fixed for a party is a period, and possibly a prolonged period, out of power. Long enough, I would hope, for the people of Scotland not to have to worry about them ever again.
Indeed, and of course, if they needed somebody to referee a contest, then the Scottish Conservative would suggest they had an ideal candidate in their leader. However, for the Labour Party, there are calls today where they have revived the ID cards idea to control immigration. Labour's shadow immigration minister has raised the prospect of a Labour government introducing ID cards to help count how many people there are in the UK and reduce what he called irregular immigration. According to Stephen Kinnock, the party is considering proposals to require everyone to apply for registration. However, the amount of data stored would be limited in an attempt to assuage the concerns that emerged during Tony Blair's premiership 2 decades ago about the infringement of civil liberties. Labour's attempt to introduce ID cards 20 years ago was mired in controversy about the cards being linked to state entitlements, as well as broader civil liberties objections. Legislation for compulsory ID cards was passed in 2006, but in 2009, the then Home Secretary, Alan Johnson, rode back and announced they would not be compulsory for UK citizens. The legislation was ultimately repealed by the Conservative Liberal coalition in 2010. William, the ID cards is always a fairly hot topic when it comes to civil liberties and what they're going to be used for. And here, it seems an odd thing to raise But then again, they're in a fix down south of the north in terms of immigration. They seem to have whose clothing of the right are we going to be wearing this time next week?
Yeah. ID cards are probably not as controversial in other countries than they always have been here. And I sometimes wonder if that's because the people of the UK know fine well that ID cards would be the thin end of the wedge. And however anodyne they might appear when they're first introduced, there would be a kind of mission creep where suddenly new things were added to them. And under certain circumstances, we do get into a situation where you're walking along the street and somebody demands, where are your papers? And we absolutely never want to get there. Interestingly, in terms of coming legislation, the need for ID at elections is going to come up, and a number of documents have been cited as acceptable. And one of the potential answers to the unaffordability of some of these documents, which basically effectively disenfranchises a certain proportion of the population, would be for there to be a cheap or indeed free system of ID cards where everybody could have ID. ID cards in Europe would be seen as something potentially helpful. But, as I say, I don't think we can trust our government in this country. And it's interesting that it's Labour trying to out-fascist the Tories. I mean, really, that's it. We'll be harder than the Tories on this, that, and the other. Again, not a good look. Don't be so energetic about moving into that space, please, because there needs to be something that people can hold on to at the end of the day.
I remember in the House of Commons, it was Mary Black talking about how the Labour Party she grew up was a signpost, not a weather vane. And that what seems to be happening is that people are moving in order to fix their poll ratings on the basis of a focus group, on the basis of where the wind is blowing, rather than this is what we believe in.
Yeah.
And when it comes to ID cards and elections and the franchise, that clearly is something that's quite concerning.
It's quite concerning. It's been part of Labour politics probably since Tony Blair, possibly before, but certainly Tony Blair. He was the first one to be looking at focus groups and what they were thinking, rather than what are the core principles. I mean, he started by ditching Clause 4, so core principles were not a big thing for Tony Blair. And I suspect that the Corbyn years are now seen as, by the party hierarchy, as an experiment that failed. I feel it was an experiment that wasn't tried, but there you go. The party hierarchy will have its way. Keir Starmer, I'm afraid, shows every look of being a weather vane, I'm afraid.
Indeed. And if the rise of the right and the influence of their ideals and ideas are a worry in the United Kingdom, then today is the day that US voters are voting in their midterm elections. Voters casting their final ballots in closely fought elections that will determine whether Democrats lose control of Congress and with it the ability to push forward on President Biden's agenda in the next 2 years. The party that controls the White House typically loses seats in midterm elections, and polls suggest concerns about high inflation and crime could be outweighing abortion rights in their violent assault on the US Capitol on the 6th of January 2021. 35 Senate seats and all 435 House of Representatives seats are on the ballot. Republicans are tipped to pick up the 5 seats they need to control the House, whilst the Senate currently split 50-50 with Democrats holding the tie-breaking vote could come down to the tight races in Pennsylvania, Nevada, Georgia and Arizona. Last night, ex-President Trump sent his strongest hint yet that he would be kicking off his 3rd consecutive White House campaign soon, telling supporters in Ohio that he would be making a big announcement next Tuesday. More than 42 million Americans voted ahead of Election Day, either by mail or in person, according to data from the US Election Project. State election officials caution that full results may not be known for days as they count ballots in close races, with control of the US Senate perhaps not known until a potential December 6 runoff in Georgia. There are also 36 governors' races, including campaigns in the swing states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona and Georgia. The last election, it took a bit of time to see whether it was going to go red or whether it was going to be blue, and who was going to win between Biden and Trump. It's going to take a little bit of time before we find out the full impact of what happens in America from today. But there are trends in there that are really, really concerning.
It's not really that long since it looked as if the Democrats were going to do okay here. Roe v. Wade was a big issue that was gaining them a wee bit of traction. And also the memory of January the 6th and that debacle at the Capitol. And that seems all to have been swept away. Possibly economic worries are the big driver. But again, it just shows what a horribly polarised country, it's not the only one, but certainly it is, America has become. And there was an article in the Sunday National by Jared Stacey that is a bit of a long read, but well worth looking at, that just looked at the polarisation and where we are. And one statistic that he quoted was that of those standing in these midterm elections, there are 185 candidates who still believe the 2020 election was a fraud. And 2/3 of them have a better than 90% chance of being elected. So you can see all sorts of potential down the line if it really goes south. You can see a majority in both houses leading to Biden getting impeached on something. You can certainly see any legal moves that would prevent Donald Trump from standing for election, they'll be swept aside. And certainly Trump or Trump-light will be there in the 2024 election. And I do not see him losing if that happens.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned earlier on about how the Conservative Party used to have a sensible wing and then the whip was withdrawn and off they went. And the sort of litmus test for the grand old party in America seems to be whether you believed in the election being stolen or not. And now we see swathe of Republican candidates who are of that alt-right, ultra-right, Trumpian background and belief system. So it's sweeping all over the place. We might feel that democracy won in Brazil, but is democracy going to win in America?
It seems to me that the fight for democracy is looking pretty like a slow slide to defeat at the moment, with the odd little victory coming in just to make you think, oh, is this the turnaround? And the election of Lula in Brazil was certainly one of those. But I suspect those of us who believe in some sort of order and democracy in society and in the world are not going to enjoy the results of these elections when we eventually get to hear them all. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm going through a pessimistic phase in my life. Maybe that's all it is.
I join you. I can't think what the question would be where the answer is Donald Trump. And I think that that's probably one thing that over here we look at America. We used to say, America sneezed, the UK caught the cold. This is something which has a global significance because this is the leader of the free world. And going back to COP27, of course, Donald Trump is the one who ripped up the Paris Accord. So there is a huge global significance of what is happening over there that could affect all our lives.
Yes, it could. And if one hesitates to predict, but if Trump does get elected or a Trump-like figure gets elected, because there are younger candidates such as Ron DeSantis just waiting in the wings should the Donald decide not to stand. But you can expect any promises that America makes at COP27 to be rapidly ripped up if they haven't been fulfilled by the time the 2024 election pans out.
And finally tonight, the National Care Service could take Scotland way beyond what other countries aspire to. The Scottish Government's plan for the National Care Service have been commended by a leading expert giving evidence to Holyrood's Health, Social Care and Sport Committee. Taking evidence on the National Care Service Scotland Bill this morning, the committee heard from Derek Feely, Chair of the Independent Review of Adult Social Care, who said that there were huge opportunities in the bill and that it is incredibly encouraging that we are having this conversation about human rights when it comes to the Scottish Government's approach to a national care service. Mr Feely went on to say that in Scotland we could be way beyond what other countries aspire to if the Scottish Government's ambitions are to be realised. Commenting, SNP MSP Evelyn Tweed said, "It is incredibly encouraging to hear experts like Derek Feely talking about the possibilities that lie in front of us as we establish a national care service, and the SNP is determined to make sure these are realised. We know that this is a huge task for everyone involved in its creation, but we must always focus on the fact that the benefits of achieving this and getting it right are massive. And so it is important we keep progressing the bill with care, compassion and the necessary sense of urgency to deliver a service that best serves Scotland." National Care Service, National Health Service, it's easy to see where the headline came from, but underneath there has to be some kind of real focus, attention and indeed some meat that will mean that the care for our most vulnerable are looked after and safeguarded the best that they can.
Absolutely right. The National Care Service plans are not entirely without contention. Commonweal, for example, has its own ideas about what a national care service should look like, and it doesn't necessarily look the same as the Scottish Government's. The other key thing in this whole thing is the phrase, if the Scottish Government's ambitions are to be realised, because we get back to that same old chestnut. What about the money? Where is the money going to come from? And in a straitjacket financial settlement imposed by Westminster with cuts in real terms, I think there's a danger of trying to go for the care service in a kind of half-hearted way and hope to fill in the blanks later. And that opportunity will never come. The only thing that will bring it about is, you've guessed it, independence, when we can actually start to say, right, we're in a rebuild scenario now, let's go for it. And I hope that there's the political will then to drive through what are, fairly ambitious proposals, even if not everybody agrees with them.
And of course, that's one of the reasons why this call for borrowing powers becomes so important, and why those who are on that committee saying that they don't agree with it has implications for dealing with the most vulnerable and dealing with those who need the help most.
Absolutely it does. Everything eventually comes down to the same thing. The Scottish Government cannot pay for everything. People who say that upon independence you won't have enough money to do stuff, the opposite is the case. That's the situation we're in now. We can't meet the demands because we cannot raise and we cannot borrow. Even if we were to put income taxes up to 25% for the basic rate, it's not going to touch the sides. We need to be able to properly arrange our finances. We need control of all the levers. Then we have a chance. It's still going to be a gargantuan effort to set up the care service as something that will make a real difference, but at least we'll be in the game.
And of course, again, going back to the earliest news in terms of COP27 and the £5 million that has been contributed to the climate emergency, again, what the Scottish Government is attempting to do is to put fine words and phrases into some kind of action.
Yes, but it's possible to do that when you're setting a precedent for loss and damage payments from other countries in COP27, and they might well follow, as some already have. When you're trying to completely revolutionise a particular service that's vital in your country, doing it with a little bit of money just won't cut it.
Well, that is it for this evening, and I'd like to, William, thank you very much. It's been
that was fun, wasn't it?
A fascinating night. It's been great to have you on and great to have the opportunity to chat things through. Hopefully, it'll be repeated sometime in the future. So thank you very much. And thank you very much to you. Before I go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make regular monthly payments, on behalf of us all here, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford as little as £5 a month, please consider to be becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us here to employ staff to make more programmes. But from me, Donald C. Stewart, here in the studio with William Duguid, good night. Thank you for watching.